Hey y'all, this is Darren Van Dam and you are watching Flick Connection, the show that connects you with the best movies on streaming. And today we're going to talk about 20 terrifying movies currently free to watch on Tubi. So Tubi happens to be one of my favorite free streaming platforms. I'm not paid to say that, I just like it because the ad breaks are really far apart and they're pretty short. Again, for a free streaming service. Not only that though, Tubi has a fantastic selection of movies. Now I will say, they go for quantity over quality. There's way too much stuff on Tubi to sift through and most of it is hot garbage. But whoever picks up movies for Tubi does an amazing job of getting a bunch of great picks in the mix, especially in the horror genre. I find more good, truly good horror movies on Tubi than I do on Netflix, Prime Video, almost any other streaming service. These are my favorite 20 currently available. Availability is subject to change, so make sure you've clicked that subscribe button and the little bell icon. That way you get notified when these videos release so you don't miss the movies before they're gone. But enough of that, let's go ahead and start this list off all the way back at number 20 with a highly underrated movie that is without a doubt a bad horror movie, but it's a real gem of a bad horror movie, House of Wax. Now this one was panned critically and for good reason. There's a lot of cheesiness to this movie, including one of Paris Hilton's only horror movie roles, but do not let that dissuade you. If you go into House of Wax with the right expectations, it actually does a lot of things right. At surface level, it looks like your standard horror movie, but there is a lot to love here. There's a couple of really great roles. Paris Hilton's is not one of them. However, she does have one good scene in this movie. Structure-wise, this actually has a lot in common with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but then it goes in some really bizarre directions that actually work for this movie. Because to me, the weirder this movie gets, the more it redeems itself. My next pick is a remake of a classic horror movie that a lot of people didn't like. However, if you go into the Evil Dead remake, which is just titled Evil Dead, with a set of fresh eyes, there's actually quite a lot to enjoy about this movie. A key one being the heavy use of practical effects. The original The Evil Dead is one of the most famous practical effects horror movies of all time, and they did embrace that tradition with the remake. However, the tone of this one is very different. Believe it or not, it manages to be darker and somehow more messed up than the original. In fact, this is one of the more intense movies on this list. As such, the story gets a little muddled and lost, and it just does not have the magic that the original had. But still, for a really off-putting, high production value horror movie, this one goes in some wild directions that I really liked, but probably would have liked more had this not been a remake of such a beloved movie. I understand if you didn't like that one, but just hang with me. It's a list of 20. I got plenty of time to redeem myself. Now my next pick actually has a couple of big stars, or at least they were bigger back in 2007 when this movie came out. Luke Wilson and Kate Beckinsale star in a horror movie that was also written by the same screenwriter from The Revenant. It's called VACANCY. This too has a lot in common with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's about a couple who get stranded at a motel in the middle of the night, and there are more than just peeping Toms in this motel. Imagine the worst possible scenario that could happen to you on the side of the road or at an empty motel. That's what's happening here. It's got some tones of Psycho and references to some real classic horror movies and is threaded together pretty well. This movie really doesn't ever fall flat. It's far from a masterpiece, which is why it's at the back of the list, but trust me, I do have some masterpieces on this list. My next pick is kind of a horror comedy and is certainly one of the least scary movies on this list, but the more interesting thing about the BELKO experiment is that it was written and produced by James Gunn. Now, I can see why he didn't direct this movie. While it does have a tone similar to a lot of his work, the movie overall feels very different from most of his movies, and I'm not just talking about Guardians of the Galaxy. In this movie, a group of people that work in this big office building suddenly find that everything has been locked down down, and they were actually part of an experiment where they are basically in a death match in this office building. And the things that work for the BELKO experiment are threefold. You've got a great script written by James Gunn, you've got a really interesting concept that's ultimately really well delivered in the way that this movie was produced and directed, and then the cast. There's nobody super famous in this, but it's all really great actors that make this concept work. Had it not been for the interesting performances, I don't know that you would have wanted to hang out with these people in this death match of an office building. But for anyone that's ever worked in any kind of office, there's a lot of great office-based humor in here as well. And most of it's not too cheesy or on the nose. Again, it's James Gunn. It's all clever and pretty sharp and witty, but it's also incredibly dark as well. Yet, if you're a fan of James Gunn at all, this is a really fun watch. All right, my number 16 pick on this list is probably the most messed up movie on this list, and one of the most messed up ones you're gonna see on streaming. Terrifier features Art the Clown, who can also be seen in the upcoming Terrifier 2 and All Hallows Eve, which is included with Tubi as well. But Terrifier upped his game to a whole new level. This is a classic B-level horror movie. You will notice major production flaws with this movie. They are done on purpose. It's a veneer over this entire movie. You can tell because it's consistent. There are little flaws and stuff in some of the practical effects. It's all done to kind of feel like one of those classic 80s horror movies, and it's extremely successful. In addition to that, this one just goes into some terrifyingly dark directions. In fact, back when I used to do a podcast, I did a whole episode with Catherine Corcoran, who has one of the most horrifying on-screen deaths in this movie. If you're a fan of Terrifier, definitely go check that podcast clip out. I'll put a link down in the video description. But this movie is not for everybody. If you don't have any kind of affinity for bad horror movies whatsoever, then I don't think you're gonna get Terrifier. It's just gonna be another bad horror movie for you. But if you like those types of movies, you're gonna get a lot of what they were trying to do with this one. For another really intense horror movie with some big stars in it, Eden Lake actually stars Michael Fassbender and Jack O'Connell before he was famous. This is another one about a couple out in a remote location where they suddenly get attacked by this band of teenagers. And that is it. Eden Lake has an incredibly simple setup, but the way that it's delivered and the way that they begin to be harassed by these teenagers is incredibly chilling, and then this movie just really ramps up. It does become a little bit far-fetched, but it's so intense, you're gonna forget. It's wild stuff, and it never gets too over the top. It also features just fantastic performances from everybody. They really make this simple movie work and make it much more intense than it maybe otherwise would have been. This one feels very real because it feels like something that could maybe happen to you. There's nothing supernatural or otherworldly going on here. It's just dark, grim stuff that again gets incredibly intense. Now, I bet there are some of you who still don't know that Bradley Cooper starred in a pretty good horror movie before he became a household name, and he stars in it with none other than Vinnie Jones, and it's based on a short story by the legendary Clive Barker. I'm telling you though, the Midnight Meat Train is not as silly as it sounds. In this movie, Bradley Cooper plays a photographer who begins to follow a man he believes is a serial killer. But this is written by Clive Barker, the creator of Hellraiser, so this one does have some wild, otherworldly elements going on, and it actually works. The title for this one is a little bit silly, and the tone of the movie somewhat embraces that, but overall, this is just a pretty glossy, dark, straightforward horror flick that's got some great moments in it. But I would say the title is weirder than the movie itself. This is not one of those super weird ones for people who love weird movies. It falls right in the middle somewhere. There's a lot of oddness in this movie, but it's not overbearing or anything. This one's pretty accessible, but it is kind of gross at times, so if you've got a weak stomach, I don't know why you're on this video, but this is probably not going to be the one for you. But if you do like gross stuff, my next pick is easily one of the grossest vampire movies ever made, 30 Days of Night. Now, this was actually produced by Sam Raimi, most famous for directing the Evil Dead series, and it's really his return to horror. Now, he didn't direct this, but it's his first horror project after doing the original Spider-Man trilogy, and while it doesn't really feel like Sam Raimi's work, it goes that extra mile the way that most Sam Raimi movies do. It's over the top, but in this really kind of perfect way that's enjoyable and entertaining. Now, the vampires here are incredibly creepy and dark, and this had come out after there was like sort of the Twilight book fever, but before the first movie, so there was kind of an itch to watch vampire movies, but not ones like this. These are the opposite of the Twilight vampires. They're ravenous, bloodthirsty creatures that descend on this Alaskan town that is about to experience 30 days of night. To me, the story in 30 Days of Night is fairly thin, but it makes up for that by stacking a lot of really great moments. There are a lot of fantastic scenes, including a couple from Ben Foster playing a really gnarly character. Ultimately, there's a lot to love with 30 Days of Night. My next pick is the cult classic Canadian film, Cube.
A cube.
26 rooms high, 26 rooms across.
17,576 rooms.
This was released in 1997 and was done on a fairly low budget considering how big the budget appears to be for this movie. Not only did Cube spawn a whole bunch of sequels, but it's also a precursor to movies like Saw. But what you get here is a group of people who wake up in a room, they have no idea where they are, how they got there, and not only is the room booby-trapped, but they soon discover they've got to make their way through a series of rooms, each with its own deadly challenge. And that is it for Cube. You spend the entire movie packed into this cube with these characters, and it works really well. Visually, everything is really pretty top-notch, again, for a somewhat lower budget horror movie. And while there are gross out moments, I mean, there's great practical effects with, you know, blood and guts and whatnot, but it's not overbearing or anything. This is not a gross out flick, but it's full of some really surprising moments because of all the booby traps. And ultimately, even though the story's pretty thin, there's a reason they made so many sequels and that this movie has still held up over time. I mean, in terms of this genre, it's easily one of the best ever made. My next pick is easily my favorite movie directed by Rob Zombie. I think he does a great job with his horror movies. Even though people give him mixed reviews, I'm a fan of his work. My favorite, though, is gotta be The Devil's Rejects. This is the sequel to his first movie, House of a Thousand Corpses, and to me this works better on so many levels, mainly because the characters are incredibly well developed. Now, I would never say that that is a requirement for horror movies. In fact, underdeveloped characters can work quite well in horror movies, but here you kind of come to understand why these psychopaths are the way they are. Even if you don't understand it, you get a little bit of perspective, similar to the way you got perspective into the Joker in The Dark Knight. Now, while there are some top-tier performances in this movie, I'm not comparing them to Heath Ledger's performance in The Dark Knight, but the way that they spoke and talked and sort of pontificate on all the horrible things that they do is very similar to the way that Heath Ledger talks in The Dark Knight. And it's terrifying in this movie. Not only that, the look and feel of this one is pretty incredible, and it's got an amazing soundtrack. Like a 70s rock soundtrack in a horror movie, it manages to work. Honestly, I like almost all of Rob Zombie's work, but I really do feel like this is him working at just like peak performance in terms of writing and directing. Now, if you're still hanging with me on this video, we've got 10 more movies to go through, my top 10. But if you're still hanging with me, you probably love watching movies as much as I do, which is why today's sponsor, CyberGhost VPN, is going to be a good fit for you. Now, CyberGhost, like all VPNs, keeps your web browsing safe, secure, and private. It is a smart idea to invest in a VPN to help protect yourself from things like identity theft. You really should be doing it, but if you're going to do it, I really recommend CyberGhost because they have specialized servers tailored to let you watch Netflix, Hulu, other streaming services in a variety of countries, which means with the flick of a switch, you can be watching Netflix in Germany, the UK, Australia, Canada, the US, if you're in a different country from me. And there is a different library of movies available in each country at any given time. So with this tool, you can hunt down almost any movie you want to watch, meaning a lot of these on this list, if you want to watch them without ads, use CyberGhost and you can check them out on Netflix or another streaming service. And when my viewers use the link in the description below, they can pay as low as $2.23 a month for this service. That's less than half the cost of one new release movie rental, plus 4 free months in addition to that. It's a fantastic deal, and CyberGhost is super easy to use. They also offer a 45-day money-back guarantee, so if you're not happy with it, there's literally no risk. You can use it for 6 weeks. And they've got great 24/7 customer support, so if you need any help getting it set up on multiple devices, which you're going to want to do because you can use it on up to 7 devices at the same time, they're there to help you with that as well. Again, go to the link in the description, pay as little as $2.23 and get 4 extra months free on me. It's a fantastic deal to help you unlock more movies than you could ever possibly hope to watch. But with that, let's go ahead and move on with the top 10 movies on this list. Now, I am a total sucker for solid sequels, mainly because they don't come along very often, especially when it's a much delayed sequel to a really beloved movie. However, Dr. Sleep is a fantastic follow-up to The Shining, and I consider The Shining to be one of the greatest horror movies ever made. I understand Stephen King doesn't like that movie, and I don't care. Stanley Kubrick is a genius, and I really doubted that Dr. Sleep was going to be able to follow in the footsteps of The Shining because nobody's brain quite works like Stanley Kubrick's. However, this movie does not feel like The Shining. It feels like something that happened much, much later, which it is, yet it still works incredibly well. In this movie, Ewan McGregor plays an older Danny who survived the horrors of the original The Shining incident and is suffering with a lot of problems. Now, obviously the book went into much more details and the movie had to rush past some things, but you get to revisit the hotel. It all looks amazing on screen. For a fan of the original, seeing the sets come back to life and seeing some other characters play the people from the original movie, all of that stuff was pure magic to me. But then you also get a really amazing villainous role from Rebecca Ferguson. She's one of my favorite people working today, and it was really cool to see her do this character as well. There's just a lot of great moments in this one. I will admit I was a little extra smitten with this movie. I actually saw it in a theater where they did some of the filming by accident and was almost sitting in the same spot that the actors were sitting in the movie. Yeah, but still, it is undeniably a fantastic follow-up to The Shining. Alright, there's already been quite a few sequels and remakes and derivative things on this list, but if we're going to talk about things that are derivative, one of the most ultimate movies ever done in that way is gotta be Brightburn.
I will never turn against our son.
He's not my son!
Now, the backstory on this is that it is also written and produced by James Gunn, directed by somebody else, but the concept here is essentially an evil Superman. Now, this movie actually has no affiliation with DC, yet James Gunn was able to get permission to do this really wild concept where you've essentially got the same basis as Superman. There is this humanoid alien that crash lands on Earth as a young boy, yet as he begins to discover his powers, he does not use them for good. In fact, he kind of goes in a direction you think a teenager might go if they suddenly had what appears to be ultimate power, and it is dark stuff. Yet this is a really well-produced movie. It's got some fantastic effects. The kid playing the main character, not only is he good, but the costume design, just everything's really creepy with this movie. It's got some great gross-out moments. Again, it's James Gunn. But in addition to just being a good production and kind of a good creepy movie, the delivery of the concept here was just top-notch stuff. Now, I've already invoked the name of Stephen King here on this video, and my next pick is based on one of his short stories, and I think it's one of the more underrated movies based on Stephen King's work, 1408. I'll start by saying this is an incredible PG-13 horror movie. I say that because the PG-13 rating on most horror movies ends up kind of neutering it. They never really get off the ground, and the scares don't work, and the violence isn't as visceral as it should be. in a horror movie. However, the unique nature of 1408 allows it to be PG-13 and still be scary without ever feeling like it's holding back too much. But in 1408, John Cusack is a man who debunks paranormal happenings, and he stays in this infamous room, 1408, at the Dolphin Hotel. During his stay there, though, really wild Stephen King-y things start happening, and what's great about 1408 is that it just continues to escalate and gets wilder and crazier, yet it always works. It never really loses the audience, and even though it goes in some really mind-bending directions. So this is a great one for people who do not like gore but like good mystery movies. This one not only has a good mystery, but there's some really intense supernatural stuff happening here as well that all works really well on film. Now, during the Midnight Meat Train portion of the review, I mentioned Clive Barker, who's most famous for creating the Hellraiser series. Maybe you don't know, he also wrote a short story that was later turned into Candyman. But my favorite Clive Barker project is NIGHTBREED.
Everything's true. God's an astronaut. Oz is over the rainbow. And Midian's where the monsters live.
Now, this is one of the least frightening movies on this list, but it's also got some of the most practical effects packed into it. In fact, this was released in 1990, meaning they filmed it in the 80s, and it definitely feels like an 80s movie. There are not computer effects, it's all costumes and makeup with countless costumes and characters that are all interesting. And this one is twisted and gory and all sorts of dark, yet it's not a complete terror fest. This is much more of a dark fantasy movie. So if that sounds like you in any way, shape, or form, I'm telling you, NIGHTBREED is an incredible movie that is just, for some reason, highly underrated. Maybe because Hellraiser is more popular. Some of those movies are quite good, but there's nothing quite like NIGHTBREED. Quentin Tarantino makes the list with probably his worst reviewed movie ever, but Death Proof still got really good reviews. It's just not his strongest reviews, and I can kind of see why. This might actually be his weakest movie, at least out of ones that he directed, yet it still ranks in my top 10. I would also say this is the least scary movie on this list. In fact, the first half is pretty chatty, but if you like Quentin Tarantino's dialogue, then there's plenty to love in the first half of the movie. Then it turns into essentially a stunt movie more than a horror movie. Zoe Bell kind of turns into the main character in the second half. She is a famous stunt woman, and everything that you see in this movie is 100% real. She's actually holding on to the front of this car at actual speeds, and it is fantastic stuff. That is what makes this movie work. You get this amazing Quentin Tarantino dialogue, heavy thing in the front, and then this amazing stunt piece with Kurt Russell as well. He's one of my favorite actors of all time. He rarely plays bad guys. He's fantastic in this. So that said, even though it's maybe my least favorite Quentin Tarantino movie, it's still fantastic stuff. Now, some of you probably remember when Death Proof released in theaters, they also showed you Planet Terror, directed by Robert Rodriguez, at the same time. I actually like that one better just because, I don't know, it's more fun, and it's got a lot in common with my next pick. In fact, probably the most in common with my next pick, The Return of the Living Dead. This is actually one of only 2 movies directed by the legendary Dan O'Bannon. If that name does not sound familiar with you, he developed the original idea and screenplay for Alien. So he is a legend in terms of sci-fi horror, and Return of the Living Dead is a really fun zombie movie. Now, there are remakes and sequels to this. I highly recommend you watch the original. It is incredibly fun. I mean, if you just look at some of the visuals here, it's classic stuff. Zombies coming up out of foggy cemeteries, incredible practical effects for the time that actually still work pretty well today. And again, just like NIGHTBREED, While they're not quite characters, there's different types of zombies in this movie, and they're all, again, practical effects, and they're all really creative and clever and different. So this one is one of the most fun zombie movies ever made, yet it's still a good horror movie. Blood, guts, jump scares, the whole thing, yet you can really have a lot of fun with the Return of the Living Dead. Speaking of zombies, my next pick comes from South Korea and is one of the best zombie movies to have been released in the last 10 years, Train to Busan. Now this is one that has been my #1 pick on Netflix list in years past, and it's my #4 pick here. That's how good of a horror selection Tubi has. But Train to Busan is about a father taking his daughter on a train trip when suddenly a massive zombie apocalypse breaks out. Very similar to the one in World War Z, I consider Train to Busan to be a superior movie on many levels. The story of this father and daughter and some of the other people on the train, I think, is more heartfelt than some of the story in World War Z, and most of the effects you see are practical. It's real makeup and stuff, which to me is just more terrifying than CGI zombies will ever be. But ultimately, just a solid story on this one. This is a movie I have recommended for years, and I have watched it over the years with friends and family. I've yet to come across anyone that not only didn't like this movie, that didn't love it. My #3 pick also comes from South Korea, and it is a fantastic serial killer flick. It's called I Saw the Devil, and it's kind of a mix between Silence of the Lambs and a martial arts movie. But unlike your typical serial killer movies where there's like a detective trying to get down to the bottom of things, here you're dealing with this special agent who's actually trying to get revenge on this really vicious serial killer. And the way he's going about getting revenge is by finding him, catching him, for lack of a better word, f***ing his shit up, and then letting him go multiple times. It's wild stuff, and it works. This is a really good movie too. I mean, it's not just violence and gore and stuff for the sake of it. This is actually a really solid story with a really interesting delivery and a top-notch production. This is a really good serial killer flick. Again, I've recommended this one a few times over the years, and everybody seems to love it as much as I do. Now, my #2 pick is going to give you a sense of how highly I regarded some of the ones I just spoke about by ranking them so closely to Tobe Hooper's masterpiece, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now, I need to start by pointing out that this movie has been one of the most influential horror movies ever made, not only because they made remakes and sequels and all of that, but because its tone and structure, its look, and essentially the way that it goes about scaring you was copied and continues to be copied today. Part of what makes the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre so terrifying, though, is kind of the grungy way that it was shot. It makes it feel more real. It's almost like a documentary at times. And unlike a lot of classic movies that are the quote-unquote best because they're the original, I would say that about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, except it's the best because it is actually directed the best. I mean, the scares are built and stacked in a way that are absolutely terrifying and upsetting in this movie, and it all functions and works together incredibly well. I am a fan of Tobe Hooper's other movies. Even his lower budget ones that don't quite work nearly as well as this one, I still love them. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is just a brilliant masterpiece that is still highly regarded today because of how well it was done. Not for nostalgic reasons, I'm telling you, because of how kind of perfectly this thing was put together. Now, after gushing about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, one of the most famous horror movies of all time, what could be my #1 pick on a list of free movies? Again, these movies are free, and they're all listed in the top pinned comment down below. My recommendation is to scroll down there, do a screen grab with your phone or whatever device you're watching me on, and then you've got the full list right there to carry with you for the rest of the month. But my #1 pick was done by Sam Raimi, who I've talked about on this video already, and it's his masterpiece, The Evil Dead. I told you I'd redeem myself for putting the remake at number 19 on this list. The Evil Dead is one of the best horror movies ever made for multiple reasons, but hang with me if you've never seen it because it does need some context. This is one of the most famous indie movies ever made. After doing a bunch of short films, Sam Raimi collected roughly $1 million from individual private investors to shoot this movie, and The Evil Dead is packed with more special effects than any horror movie on this list, and at the time that it was released, probably more than any movie before it. And not just special effects, but cutting edge gore special effects that just continue to hit bam, 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 bam after this movie takes off. It is non-stop. What's so great about The Evil Dead is not that it spawned sequels and series and all sorts of pop culture, is that the first one works really well, but then if you watch The Evil Dead 2, it is essentially a remake of the first one with even better effects. It's just another crack at the same thing, and I love that about those two movies. But this first one does work as a classic horror movie because of the way that it was made. It was cutting edge at the time, and so many of the fun camera effects used in this movie still make for a fun watch today. If you want to get really wild while you watch this movie, especially and maybe only if you've seen it, I did a live watch back, I think before the pandemic. I'll put a link to that in the description as well. You can actually time it and watch The Evil Dead with me. I'll provide some additional commentary, much more than I can squeeze in to this particular video, but that's the list. Let me know if there's any additional recommendations you've got. Who knows, one of yours might make it onto a future video. If you want more recommendations though, please go to DarrenVanDam.com. There's a link to that in the description as well. I've got recommendations on the homepage as well as links to some of my recent videos. You can even sign up for my free newsletter where I'll email you movie recommendations straight to your inbox almost every week. But I will keep making these videos as long as you keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this special horror list, and you will see me on the next one.